Johannes Brahms is often mentioned in the same breath as Bach and Beethoven. Together they were known as Germany's famous 3 Bs. But did this exalted comparison produce one of the most self-critical composers ever known? Most of us, whether we realize it or not, have had exposure to Brahms at a very early age.
Guten Abend, gut Nacht, mit Rosen bedacht, mit Näglein besteckt.
His music is so warm. There's a very human quality about it. It's like a great big hug. It's probably the best way I can describe it.
Wirst du wieder geweckt, morgen früh, wenn Gott will, wirst du wieder geweckt.
Brahms is solid. Brahms is eternal. Brahms is a lullaby, and he's also the German Requiem. There's an enormous span in what Brahms has to say, from intimate, small statements to huge, towering symphonic edifices.
I can almost touch the sound, it's so thick. So it's not just a bunch of waves coming to me, but almost a bunch of waves that have some substance on them that we can feel, physically feel.
Musicians love playing Brahms, not because it's easy, but because it just stretches you in every possible way, musically, humanistically, spiritually, and technically. Just a glorious workout.
Brahms was a romantic composer who looked backwards in many ways. He looked at all the classical forms. He looked at the classical harmonies. He was not a forward-thinking composer like some of his colleagues who were expanding the harmonic structure. He composed really respecting his predecessors.
Whereas Wagner, his contemporary, really didn't give a monkeys and just did whatever he wanted to do. Whichever way his whim went, he went. Brahms was still steeped in that world of classicism, that, as it were, that forging of the marble, whereas Wagner had almost thrown away the marble and was trying new and different forms of composing.
Brahms did have a romantic side to him, though. It's this fine balance that he struck between the classical and romantic forms that makes him one of the most important composers of the 19th century. Brahms, more than any other composer of the Romantic era, was responsible for reviving the concept of absolute music. Music that is just for itself, to be accepted on its own terms as interplays of sound. He used established techniques like counterpoint and variation in such novel ways that the listener first appreciates the beauty and the strength of the music, rather than the talent of the individual performing it. This anti-virtuoso approach was a far cry from that of Liszt, whose compositions were virtuosic in nature and featured the musician more than the music. Let me demonstrate for you a virtuoso piece by Liszt. This is the initial piano entry from his first piano concerto. Now, an anti-virtuoso piece by Brahms to show the difference. Here's the initial entry from his first piano concerto. He was born in Hamburg in 1833 and studied the piano from the age of 7 until his early teens. At this time, opportunities for composers to acquire musical postings in such sublime surroundings as castles and cathedrals were becoming a thing of the past. In fact, some of his first performances were in the local theaters and brothels. If Brahms was not performing, he was composing, and much of what he composed already had a serious sound to it. But this would change when he met the celebrated Hungarian violinist József Joachim, who introduced him to the rich and colorful sounds of gypsy music.
Somehow managed to incorporate the Hungarian feel, Hungarian flair, the gypsy flair, and the Hungarian tunes, which are lighter and more spicy.
The last movement of the Brahms G minor piano quartet is just thrilling.
At the age of 20, Brahms met Robert Schumann and his wife Clara. The Schumanns would ultimately have a profound effect on Brahms' career and personal life. Robert Schumann was not only an accomplished composer, but the publisher of a music magazine. He wrote of Brahms' genius, saying, "He would give the highest and most ideal expression to the tendencies of the times."
And when Schumann essentially welcomed Brahms as the new genius, it was a kind of anointing from on high. It was a scary thing to happen for a young man. He was only in his 20s, and I'm sure he must have felt very daunted by it. But it was also an enormous breakthrough for him to get this kind of recognition.
For several months, Brahms lived with Robert Schumann and his wife Clara, who was also a virtuoso pianist. He became extremely fond of both of them, and they of him, especially Clara, who was 14 years his senior.
Brahms was wildly in love with Schumann's wife, Clara. It's very unclear whether, there was actually sort of any consummation of that love. One reads about Clara and Brahms, at the piano together, talking about different works, playing through, various two-piano pieces that Brahms had written, and it would have been great to be a fly on the wall for one of those sessions.
She wasn't just a personal friend, she was a personal friend who happened to be one of the leading musicians of her day. So Clara was an important source of testing his ideas, of validating his decisions, of essentially telling him, "Johannes, you did good."
After Robert's death, Brahms and Clara remained very close. His devotion to her lasted until her death in 1896. The following year, Brahms died of cancer at the age of 63.
He was devastated by Clara's death. This was probably one of the great personal blows of his life, and he seized up creatively for a while as a result of it. And I think that it speaks to us of how closely he felt about this woman and how inspired he was by her.
In 1868, like so many great composers before him, Brahms moved to Vienna and gained a reputation for being one of its most self-critical perfectionists. He was known to agonize over each and every piece that he wrote. He said about composing, "Let it rest and keep going back to it and work it over and over until it is completed as a finished work of art, until there is not a note too much or too little, not a bar to improve on."
He destroyed a lot of his music that he did not like. Can you imagine? His lesser pieces probably are better than most of the pieces that other composers write, and he threw them away. He didn't want them to be printed or played or anything. He was very, very hard on himself.
Rather like Beethoven, he'd have the idea and then he'd forge it in many, many different ways until he was satisfied with it. He was over 40 before he completed his first symphony because he was so overawed by the sense of Beethoven, who he said was looking over his shoulder.
He was very intimidated, I think, by the 9 symphonies of Beethoven, which were written before. I think everybody after that was intimidated. No one wanted to come out and write another symphony and have it be measured up against Beethoven's 9th, which is the last one he did, because it's hard to compete with a piece of that stature. And I think Brahms wanted to make sure when he wrote his first symphony that even if it wasn't up to the level of Beethoven's Ninth, that on its own level it could be considered a great piece, and I think it is.
They concluded that he was trying to do Beethoven's work for him. Well, in a sense he did. It was the next great symphony.
It was the incredible power and perfection of Brahms' First Symphony that led von Bülow to coin the phrase, the three Bs: Bach, Beethoven, and Brahms. There are those who agree and those who disagree with this comparison. Regardless of who's right or wrong, being grouped with such illustrious fellow countrymen saddled Brahms with the burden of carrying on the legendary German-Austrian tradition of composing timeless classics. Which raises the question, why did so many great composers come from Germany and Austria?
That's a toughie. That's a toughie. Maybe it's in the sauerkraut.
I think a lot of it was to do that Germany and Austria, especially Vienna, they were the center of the world in not necessarily music even, but art and culture and everything. And music also had a lot to do with religion, which was very important at the time in Central Europe. A lot of composers would work for churches or would work for rich patrons who wanted to increase the culture in their little area, and culture being music at the time. I think there was a lot of encouragement for musicians, even if they weren't from there, to move there and to kind of work in that area because they got the recognition and the money that they deserved, basically.
Whether it was the sauerkraut or Vienna's Zuckertorte, Brahms remains undeniably one of its immortals.
The fact that so much of the music has been taken to heart by people is evidence that we're going to be venerating Brahms for a great long time. And I say that because he addresses the very young and the very old, not with the same piece, but he has that kind of range, that there is something in his music that a great variety of people at different stages of life can take and enjoy. That's not a bad legacy.
Once during a rehearsal, Brahms said with great conviction, "Gentlemen, I'm not Beethoven, but I am Johannes Brahms." He was very conscious of who he was and that he was going to be one for posterity. Comparisons to Beethoven and Bach may have made Brahms extremely self-critical, but their models inspired him to write some of the greatest music of the Romantic era.